You think your grandparents just ate grits and eggs every morning? Think again. These African American breakfasts carried tradition, survival, and love in every bite. Dishes so forgotten that even their names sound strange today. Let's dig into 60 morning meals only your grandparents knew how to make right. Potato cakes from leftover mash were the kind of breakfast that proved nothing in the kitchen ever had to be thrown away. Grandparents mixed cold mashed potatoes with flour or cornmeal, shaping the mixture into patties that fried beautifully in a hot skillet. The outside crisped into a golden crust, while the inside stayed soft, warm, and comforting. It was a thrifty breakfast that used leftovers creatively and fed everyone well without costing anything extra. The cakes were often served plain, sometimes with syrup, and sometimes with butter melting across the top. They tasted like resourcefulness, like making the most of what you had, like the kind of wisdom passed down quietly from generation to generation. Even today, people remember those potato cakes as a breakfast that felt both humble and full of heart. Brown sugar sweet grits offered a playful twist on the classic savory staple, transforming stone-ground corn into a kid-friendly morning treat. Grits were cooked slowly in milk or water until creamy, then stirred with butter and a generous spoonful of dark brown sugar. The sugar melted into the hot grains, creating a caramel-like sweetness that balanced the subtle corn flavor. Families sometimes added raisins, sliced bananas, or a sprinkle of cinnamon for extra indulgence, while others enjoyed the simple pairing of butter and sugar alone. This sweet version of grits became popular in households where children preferred a hint of dessert for breakfast, yet adults appreciated its nourishing heartiness. Brown sugar sweet grits demonstrated how one ingredient could shift from savory to sweet with a few thoughtful touches, proving that a Southern classic could adapt to changing tastes while staying rooted in tradition and comfort. Each steaming bowl brought smiles to the table and warmth that lingered long after the meal. Lard-fried corn pones were the kind of breakfast that stuck to your ribs and carried you through long hours of work or school. These dense corn patties were mixed from cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt before being fried golden in sizzling lard. The flavor was simple but deeply satisfying, with the crisp edges giving way to a soft interior that felt hearty in every bite. For families with little to spare, corn pones were portable and cheap, making them an everyday staple as well as a meal to take out into the fields. Children often carried them wrapped in cloth, while adults relied on them with strong coffee to start their mornings. They were versatile too, eaten plain, dipped in molasses, or even crumbled into buttermilk for a different kind of breakfast. Lard-fried corn pones were never fancy, but they were dependable, and that made them unforgettable. They represented resourcefulness and strength, the kind of food that reflected both necessity and comfort in kitchens where nothing went to waste. Oatmeal with brown sugar and cream was the quiet comfort of a cold morning, a dish that asked for nothing but gave everything. Rolled oats simmered slowly until soft, the steam fogging up windows and waking up sleepy kitchens. A spoonful of brown sugar swirled into the bowl, melting into ribbons of sweetness. Then came a splash of cream, turning it all silky and rich. It was breakfast that stayed with you, not just in the stomach, but in the heart. For children, it meant warmth before a long walk to school. For adults, it meant strength to face a long day. Oatmeal was a small act of love, steady and reliable, a simple way of saying, "You matter." Grandparents knew that food like this built more than bodies, it built belonging. Oatmeal with brown sugar and cream was proof that kindness could be served in a bowl. Egg and rice bowls were one of those fast, dependable breakfasts grandparents made without thinking, because the ingredients were always there and the result was always good. A pot of rice from last night could be rewarmed with a pat of butter, turning it soft and fragrant again. Then came the egg, fried or scrambled, laid gently over the top like a finishing touch. Only older hands knew how to time perfectly. The yolk soaked into the rice or the scrambled bits mixed through, creating a bowl that tasted warm, mild, and deeply comforting. It was cheap, quick, and endlessly reliable, the kind of breakfast that made mornings feel steady. Families loved it because nothing went to waste, because rice could stretch farther than any box of cereal ever could. Egg and rice bowls tasted like routine, like care, like the kind of quiet morning love that came before the sun was fully up. Cornmeal dumplings in milk were a dish that blended simplicity with comfort, making them a favorite in many households when mornings were cold and food was scarce. Dumplings were mixed from cornmeal and flour, shaped into small rounds, and simmered in sweetened milk until soft and tender. The result was both filling and slightly sweet, a dish that could serve as either breakfast or dessert depending on how it was prepared. For families with children, it was often given in the morning to ensure they had energy for school. Adults relied on it as well, especially when more costly staples like bacon or sausage were unavailable. Cornmeal dumplings in milk carried a sense of warmth and security, proof that even the humblest ingredients could create satisfaction. It was a dish remembered not only for its flavor, but for the way it stretched supplies in hard times. It became part of the rhythm of survival, tying family memories to the shared strength of the table. Scrapple was the breakfast that turned thrift into art. Born in the mid-Atlantic, it began as a mix of pork trimmings, cornmeal, and spices, cooked until thick and poured into a loaf to set. Once chilled, it was sliced and fried until crisp on the outside and soft within. The result was savory, hearty, and unlike anything else, a flavor that lingered long after the plate was empty. For generations, scrapple was the farmer's first meal, eaten with eggs or syrup depending on the mood. It carried the spirit of practicality, nothing wasted, everything used. What began as a way to stretch ingredients became a tradition, one that still lives on in diners and family kitchens. Scrapple was breakfast for people who worked hard and appreciated the simple genius of turning leftovers into something extraordinary. It was humble, yes, but it was also pride in edible form. Leftover collard greens and rice turned yesterday's dinner into today's survival. Grandparents reheated the greens slowly, letting their smoky flavor return, then folded in cooked rice until everything blended into one soulful dish. The broth turned the rice tender, absorbing all the spice and fat left behind from the pot. It was food with memory. Every bite carried yesterday's work and tomorrow's strength. The greens, once wilted, took on new life beside the soft rice, becoming breakfast that satisfied the hunger of both body and spirit. A drizzle of vinegar added brightness, a reminder that even hardship could taste alive. It was warm, it was nourishing, and it was never wasted. Families gathered around small tables, thankful that nothing from the night before went forgotten. In the quiet clatter of spoons and bowls, there was gratitude for every grain, every leaf, every bite that kept them moving forward. Some mornings, the pot would bubble again with new life, stretching the last of the greens just a little further. The meal wasn't just food, it was testimony, proof that nothing humble ever truly disappeared. It carried lessons of endurance, teaching that the best things often came from what was left behind. Stewed prunes with grits might sound plain today, but it was a dish that kept households nourished and children strong. Prunes were affordable, dried, and easy to store, making them a reliable sweetener when sugar was limited. Simmered until soft and paired with steaming bowls of grits, they turned into a balanced meal of fiber, sweetness, and filling grains. Large families often leaned on this combination because it could stretch far with little cost. For children, stewed prunes made breakfast feel less plain, while adults valued the strength it provided for long workdays. It was also a dish that traveled through generations, passed down as a memory of lean years and perseverance. Families carried bowls of this simple breakfast before marches, school, and shifts, finding strength in the comfort of familiarity. Stewed prunes with grits became a quiet but powerful dish of the civil rights era, proving that even the humblest meals could carry dignity and hope. Hoppin' John Morning Bowl carried the luck and legacy of the South into every spoonful, blending black-eyed peas, fluffy rice, and smoky bacon for a meal steeped in tradition. Peas were simmered until tender with onions, garlic, and a hint of pork, then spooned over freshly cooked rice so the savory juices soaked into every grain. A sprinkle of green onions or a splash of pepper vinegar added brightness, while some cooks stirred in diced peppers for extra color and flavor. This dish had long been served on New Year's Day for prosperity, but in the 1970s, many African American families enjoyed it year-round as a hearty breakfast. It offered protein, fiber, and deep flavor that sustained workers and schoolchildren alike. Hoppin' John Morning Bowl reminded each generation of the history carried in its ingredients, from West African roots to Southern kitchens, proving that food could nourish both body and spirit while keeping cultural memory alive with every bite of smoky, satisfying goodness. Molasses biscuits were one of those breakfasts that felt both humble and rich, depending entirely on the memory you brought to the table. The biscuits themselves were simple, mixed from flour, fat, and whatever milk or water could be spared, but it was the molasses brushed over the top that made them special. The dark sweetness soaked into the warm bread, giving each bite a deep flavor that felt like comfort stretching back generations. Grandparents baked these because molasses was cheap, shelf-stable, and full of the kind of sweetness that made children smile even when times were tight. The smell alone could bring the whole household into the kitchen, filling the air with something warm and grounding. Some families served them with butter, letting it melt into every crack, while others ate them plain, enjoying the caramel-like richness all on its own. These biscuits were not fancy, but they tasted like care, like effort, like mornings where love was baked into every crumb. They were the kind of breakfast that lingered in your memory long after the plate was empty, reminding you of kitchens where nothing was wasted and everything was shared. Field pea and rice hash turned a simple pot of peas into a hearty breakfast that fueled long days with ease. Black-eyed peas were simmered with onions, garlic, and a little smoked meat until tender, then spooned generously over steaming white rice. The flavors melded into a comforting bowl of earthy beans and fluffy grains that filled stomachs and lifted spirits. In the 1970s, this dish connected generations, recalling the Hoppin' John traditions of New Year's Day, while serving as an everyday morning staple in many African American homes. Some families stirred in hot peppers for a gentle heat, while others finished with a drizzle of pepper vinegar for brightness. Field pea and rice hash proved that a few inexpensive ingredients could yield both nourishment and rich flavor, keeping families strong and satisfied. It celebrated agricultural roots and the creativity of cooks who understood that true comfort comes from a well-seasoned pot and the love shared around the breakfast table. Molasses cornmeal custard was a dish that offered sweetness and substance while depending only on pantry staples. Families baked it by whisking cornmeal, milk, eggs when available, and molasses into a smooth mixture that thickened into a soft pudding in the oven. It was inexpensive to prepare, but filling enough to feed a household, making it a beloved breakfast or after-supper treat. The flavor was earthy and rich, with the deep sweetness of molasses carrying through each bite. Children often looked forward to it as a rare indulgence in households where desserts were not common. Adults valued it for its practicality, since it used cheap ingredients that could stretch for days. Molasses cornmeal custard represented thrift, but it also carried warmth and a sense of care, showing how families turned necessities into moments of comfort. It became part of the memory of kitchens during times of struggle, a dish that balanced scarcity with sweetness. Corn fritters with syrup were the morning's golden reward for those who knew how to turn scraps into sweetness. Leftover corn or cornmeal batter was mixed with milk, sugar, and a touch of salt, then spooned into a hot skillet where it puffed and browned into tender cakes. The air filled with the smell of butter and corn, sweet and comforting all at once. Once stacked on a plate, a drizzle of syrup sealed the deal. Sticky, glossy, irresistible. The first bite had a little crisp from the edges and a soft heart that melted on the tongue. Fritters like these were both breakfast and memory, made by grandparents who never threw a thing away. They were perfect with coffee, even better with laughter, and best when shared. No one called them fancy, but they felt that way, proof that love and creativity could make anything shine. Stewed apples with cinnamon and lard were the warmth of winter mornings in the South. Grandparents would peel the apples by hand, their fingers quick and sure, tossing each slice into an iron pot that hissed when the fat hit the heat. A spoonful of lard went first. There was no butter to spare, melting into a glossy pool that would coat every piece of fruit. Sugar was added if there was any to be found, but most times the sweetness came from the apples themselves, coaxed out by patience and low flame. Cinnamon or nutmeg, if there was some hidden in the back of the cupboard, turned the smell into something magical. The apples softened slowly, curling into tender ribbons that glowed like amber. The air filled with a warmth that made even the poorest kitchen feel rich. Served over biscuits or eaten plain from a bowl, it was the kind of meal that made children quiet with joy. It cost almost nothing but felt like everything. Grandparents said it was food for the soul, and they were right. It soothed hunger, calmed hearts, and brought everyone closer to the table. Even when times were lean, stewed apples with lard reminded families that comfort could be made from what was already there. It wasn't just breakfast, it was love made visible through steam and sugar. Coffee milk for kids was one of those small morning rituals that made children feel grown, even though the drink was mostly warm milk with only a tiny splash of coffee. Parents and grandparents mixed it carefully, just enough coffee to tint the milk a light tan and add the faintest whisper of that roasted smell adults relied on to start their day. It was soothing, warm, and familiar. The kind of drink that made sleepy children perk up before school without giving them the full strength of adult coffee. Many African American households use this as a way to include children in the morning rhythm, letting them feel part of the adult world while still keeping things gentle. The taste was mild and slightly sweet, especially when a bit of sugar was added, and it had a comforting creaminess that stuck with you long after the cup was empty. The mornings felt quieter back then, slower, filled with the soft sounds of spoons stirring and radios humming low in the background. Coffee milk was not just a drink, it was a moment, a shared start to the day that made you feel loved and included. Even now, the memory of that warm cup brings people back to kitchens filled with steam, conversation, and the steady comfort of family. Red-eye ham and coffee gravy provided a bold, bracing start to the morning with a flavor that lingered long after breakfast was done. Thick slices of country-cured ham were seared in a heavy skillet until their edges browned and their fat rendered into a savory base. Into that sizzling pan went black coffee, which deglazed the salty bits and created a thin, smoky gravy. The sharp bitterness of coffee balanced the ham's rich saltiness, producing a sauce both surprising and addictive. Poured over warm biscuits or spooned onto grits, the gravy soaked in and carried a gentle caffeine kick that woke up the senses. Families across the South prized this dish for its simplicity and strength, a reminder of farm mornings when nothing went to waste. Red-eye ham and coffee gravy reflected the ingenuity of African American cooks who transformed pantry basics into something unforgettable, a breakfast that spoke of resilience and tradition with every deep, savory bite. Homemade syrup sandwiches were one of the quickest breakfasts for children heading to school or adults heading to work. A slice of bread was spread with cane syrup or sorghum, then topped with another slice and eaten on the go. It was sticky, sweet, and satisfying, even if it was far from fancy. Families leaned on it because it was cheap, easy, and gave just enough energy to last until the next meal. For children, it often felt like a treat, even when it was born out of necessity. Adults remembered it as a sign of thrift, proof that households made do with what they had. Homemade syrup sandwiches were a dish of survival and memory, tied to the realities of life in communities that faced both economic and social hardship. They symbolized not only sweetness in lean times, but also the determination to keep moving forward each morning, fueled by the simplest of meals. Country ham with red-eye gravy was the kind of breakfast that woke the whole house before anyone sat down to eat. Thick slices of salt-cured ham hit a hot skillet, sizzling and popping until the edges turned crisp and caramelized. Once the ham was done, a splash of black coffee went straight into the pan, loosening up all those browned bits and transforming them into a smoky, savory gravy. That strange little mix of ham drippings and coffee was magic, salty, bitter, and rich all at once. Served with biscuits, the gravy soaked into every crumb, the kind of flavor that could only come from patience and cast iron. It was a dish that spoke of early mornings and hard work, the kind of food made to keep a farmer going until noon. Every family had their own method, their own rhythm of stirring and scraping the pan. Red-eye gravy was never about looks. It was about the smell, the sound, the taste of something honest. Country ham and red-eye gravy made even an ordinary morning feel proud. Cabbage and onions with cornbread made a humble breakfast that filled both the belly and the heart. When meat was scarce, the skillet became a garden feast. Grandparents chopped cabbage fresh from the yard or the market, tossing it with sliced onions and a bit of lard or grease. The smell that rose from the pan was earthy and warm, like hope frying slow. As it cooked down, the cabbage softened and the onions turned sweet, making a broth rich enough to dip bread into. Cornbread baked in the oven beside it, crusty on top and tender inside. The two came together on the plate, steam rising in quiet grace. It was not fancy, but it was full of care. The kind of meal that kept families going through hard seasons, reminding them that flavor did not come from plenty. It came from patience. Every bite spoke of the land, of effort, and of faith in simple things. The cornbread soaked up the juices, catching every drop like a blessing. In those moments, a table without meat still felt abundant, and no one left hungry. Fried cornmeal mush with syrup was one of those breakfasts that quietly carried families through the hardest decades, long before boxed cereal took over the mornings. A pot of mush would be cooked and thickened the night before because nothing could go to waste, and cornmeal was one of the cheapest staples you could rely on. By sunrise, it would be firm enough to slice, each piece hitting the skillet with that gentle hiss that meant breakfast was truly beginning. The outside browned until crisp, while the inside stayed soft, warm, and steady, making every bite feel both hearty and familiar. When syrup was poured over those golden slices, it turned the humble dish into something sweet and comforting, the kind of sweetness that did not need to be fancy to feel special. Grandparents made this because it filled bellies, stretched ingredients, and tasted like something far richer than it really was. Children did not think about thrift or struggle, they just knew it tasted like love served on a plate. Fried mush might look simple today, but its roots run deep in memory, in resilience, in the way older generations held families together one skillet breakfast at a time. Even now, one bite brings back chilly mornings, warm kitchens, and the soft scrape of a metal spatula flipping a slice just right. Okra and tomato breakfast stew offered a savory morning alternative that celebrated the summer garden's best. Fresh okra pods were sliced and simmered with ripe tomatoes, onions, and a hint of garlic until the vegetables softened into a flavorful broth. The natural thickening quality of okra gave the stew a gentle body, making it perfect for ladling over warm cornbread. Some families added smoked sausage or a pinch of cayenne for a heartier dish, while others kept it purely vegetarian, letting the vegetables shine. Served steaming hot, it filled the kitchen with a scent both earthy and bright, reminding everyone of harvest days and backyard gardens. Okra and tomato breakfast stew reflected African American traditions of making the most of seasonal produce, proving that breakfast could be savory, sustaining, and deeply tied to the land. It invited families to gather early and savor the simple pleasure of fresh vegetables cooked with care and served with love. Homemade apple butter toast was a breakfast that stretched the fruits of summer into the long months of winter. Families would cook apples down with spices until they formed a thick, sweet spread, preserving it in jars for the cold seasons. Spread over stale bread, biscuits, or cornbread, apple butter transformed plain staples into something comforting. It was a way of saving harvests, ensuring that fruit could be enjoyed long after the orchards were bare. Apple butter toast was often served to children before school, giving them a sense of sweetness and strength in the mornings. Adults valued it for its practicality, as a single jar could last weeks and provide flavor to otherwise bland meals. It was not just a spread, but a memory of orchards, harvest work, and the determination to make food last. Apple butter toast became a symbol of both survival and warmth, offering families a taste of sweetness during hard times. Fried bologna sandwiches were born from necessity, but remembered for love. Thick slices of bologna hit a hot skillet and curled at the edges, sizzling in their own fat until browned and crisp. A fried egg or a slice of cheese might join the sandwich if luck allowed, but even plain, it was perfection. Served between two pieces of soft white bread or a biscuit, it was salty, savory, and satisfying. This was the kind of breakfast that did not apologize for being simple. It was fuel for long days, a way to stretch a few cents into something hearty. Children carried them in brown paper bags, while adults grabbed one before heading out to work. The smell of frying bologna filled the house, and even the neighbors could tell breakfast was ready. It was a reminder that good food did not have to be fancy. It only had to be made with care. For many families, this humble sandwich was a badge of resilience, the proof that they could make something delicious out of whatever they had. Fried apples and bread turned scraps into satisfaction. Old apples, soft and spotted, were sliced and tossed into a pan with sugar, butter, or lard. The smell of caramel and warmth filled the room as they softened and browned. Day-old bread joined the mix, soaking up every drop of syrupy sweetness. It was rich, sweet, and comforting, the kind of meal that made even the poorest kitchens feel rich. Grandparents served it warm, sometimes with a sprinkle of cinnamon if they had it. The taste lingered like kindness itself, proof that waste was never an option when love and patience were in the kitchen. The sizzling sound from the skillet was music, soft, steady, and full of promise. Kids would gather near the stove, waiting for their turn with a fork. Even on the leanest mornings, this dish made the home smell alive. It was food made from nothing but hope, sweetened by care. Rice and raisins with butter was the kind of breakfast that felt like a treat, even though it came from the most basic pantry ingredients a household always had on hand. Long before sugary cereal brands took over the shelves, many families started their day with a warm bowl of rice simmered until soft and mixed with sweet raisins that plumped in the heat. A pat of butter melted over the top, coating each grain and adding richness that made the dish feel far more indulgent than its low cost suggested. It was warm, steady, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that felt like a hug before school or chores. Grandparents made it because rice was cheap, raisins lasted forever in a jar, and butter brought everything together in a way that tasted wholesome and familiar. Some added a sprinkle of sugar, others a dash of cinnamon, but most kept it simple, letting the steam rise like a quiet morning ritual. The flavor was gentle, the sweetness mild, and the bowl always seemed to disappear faster than expected. For many families, this dish was tied to winter mornings, cold floors, and the feeling of being cared for before the day even started. Even today, people who grew up with rice and raisins remember the way it filled the house with warmth and made them feel ready for anything. Fried bologna. Breakfast sandwiches turned a simple deli meat into a beloved morning indulgence across African-American neighborhoods. Thick slices of bologna were scored around the edges to keep them from curling, then fried in a hot skillet until the surface blistered and caramelized. The sizzling meat was stacked onto soft white bread with a fried egg, crisp lettuce, or a slice of tomato, creating a sandwich that was both hearty and comforting. Some cooks added a swipe of mustard or a layer of melted cheese, while others preferred it plain to let the smoky flavor shine. Affordable and quick, it became a weekday staple for families and workers needing a satisfying meal before heading out the door. Fried bologna breakfast sandwiches captured the era's love of bold, simple flavors and the creativity of cooks who turned modest ingredients into something memorable, proving that even the humblest cuts could create a breakfast worth savoring with every crisp, savory bite. Cabbage and egg scramble was one of those quick, no-fuss breakfasts that households relied on when the pantry was light. Leftover cabbage, chopped fine, was sautéed in fat before being stirred into scrambled eggs, turning two basic foods into a sustaining dish. The cabbage stretched the eggs further, allowing larger families to fill plates without needing a dozen. It was hearty, yet inexpensive, providing vitamins and protein in a simple skillet meal. Farm families especially leaned on it, as cabbage was easy to grow and kept well into the colder months. The dish carried a humble flavor, but with hot sauce or pepper sprinkled on top, it was comforting and memorable. Children may not have loved cabbage, but when folded into eggs, it became tolerable and even enjoyable. For adults, it was practical, quick to make before long days of work, and efficient in using every bit of food available. Cabbage and egg scramble was modest, but it was deeply tied to survival and resilience in daily life. Biscuits and sausage gravy were the heart and soul of country breakfasts. Flaky biscuits baked fresh, split open, and drenched in a thick, peppery gravy made from sausage drippings, flour, and milk. The smell alone could wake the whole house. It was a meal that filled the stomach and soothed the spirit, one that required no fancy tools, only time and care. The gravy clung to every crumb, rich and savory, while the biscuits absorbed just enough to stay soft. This was the food of hospitality, the dish you made when guests came or when you simply wanted to treat your own family right. Every cook had their secret: more pepper, a touch of butter, maybe a pinch of sage. But no matter how it was made, it always meant comfort. Biscuits and sausage gravy were the definition of generosity served hot. Rice and sugar with evaporated milk was the sweet salvation of the empty pantry. When fresh milk was gone and the cupboard was bare, grandparents turned leftover rice into breakfast magic. A little sugar, a splash of canned milk, and a stir over the stove brought it all together. The smell was soft, like sweetness and hope combined. It was warm and creamy, simple but satisfying, a meal that wrapped the stomach in comfort. Kids loved it because it felt like dessert, even when it was dinner from the night before reborn. Grandparents called it rice pudding without the fuss. It tasted like kindness and invention, like the beauty of never wasting what little you had. It was proof that love and survival could fit in a single bowl. Fried bologna biscuits were the kind of breakfast that made you feel like you were getting something special even when money was tight. Grandparents would slice thick rounds of bologna and lay them into a popping skillet, letting the edges curl and brown until the flavor deepened into something smoky and rich. The hot slices were tucked into fresh biscuits, often homemade or leftover from the night before, absorbing just enough of the bologna's warmth to soften perfectly. It was salty, savory, and incredibly satisfying, the kind of handheld breakfast that felt almost luxurious despite coming from inexpensive ingredients. Children loved the way the biscuit crumbled slightly with each bite, mixing with the bold taste of the fried bologna. Adults appreciated how easy it was to make and how far it could stretch the budget. This was the kind of food that reminded families that good meals did not need fancy ingredients or long cooking times. All they needed was a skillet, some biscuits, and someone who knew how to make simple food feel unforgettable. Fried apples with brown sugar filled kitchens with the scent of caramel and spice as butter sizzled in heavy skillets across African-American homes of the 1970s. Thick apple slices were laid into the pan where they softened and browned, soaking up melted butter and a slow sprinkle of dark brown sugar. The sugar melted into a glossy syrup that coated every piece, creating a warm and fragrant side that paired perfectly with hot bread or flaky biscuits. Some cooks added a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg, while others squeezed in a little lemon juice to brighten the sweetness. Families loved these fried apples as a weekend treat, serving them alongside sausage, grits, or even spooned over pancakes for an indulgent start to the morning. The dish honored a tradition of turning simple farm fruit into something special without wasting a single ingredient. Fried apples with brown sugar captured the heart of home-style cooking, transforming an everyday apple into a rich and memorable breakfast delight. Mustard greens with cornbread was a savory pairing that many families leaned on as a breakfast, though it was eaten at other times of day too. Mustard greens, boiled until tender, were seasoned with bits of pork fat or salt for flavor. Eaten alongside hot cornbread, the meal balanced vitamins with starch, offering both nutrition and energy. It was cheap, filling, and deeply tied to tradition. For children, the bitterness of the greens was often softened by crumbling cornbread into the potlikker broth, making it more palatable. Adults valued it as a sustaining meal that honored resourcefulness and cultural heritage. Mustard greens with cornbread symbolized strength and survival, representing the kind of food that nourished more than just hunger. It was humble, but it carried families through mornings when resources were thin, but resolve was strong. This dish was one of the quiet backbones of community kitchens, a reflection of endurance and resilience during times of hardship. Sweet potato biscuits brought natural sweetness and a warm orange glow to breakfast plates, showcasing a root vegetable long cherished in African American kitchens. Mashed cooked sweet potatoes were folded into a dough of flour, butter, and a touch of milk, creating a dough that baked into soft, tender biscuits. The sweet potatoes added moisture and a gentle, earthy flavor, while a hint of cinnamon or nutmeg provided subtle spice. As they baked, the biscuits released a fragrant aroma that signaled a special morning treat. Families served them warm with butter, honey, or cane syrup, turning a simple biscuit into a celebration of the harvest. Sweet potato biscuits captured the creativity of home cooks who used seasonal produce to enrich everyday meals, blending tradition with a touch of sweetness. Their bright color and comforting taste made them a favorite for children and adults alike, proving that wholesome ingredients could create a breakfast that was both nourishing and delightfully indulgent. Leftover pie for breakfast was a common occurrence in large households where nothing was wasted. Sweet potato pie, chess pie, or fruit pies baked the night before were often sliced and eaten cold in the morning with coffee or milk. For children, it was an exciting way to begin the day, while adults saw it as practical and filling. It reflected the rhythm of large families, where every meal had to stretch and desserts could not be reserved only for evenings. Leftover pie carried both joy and necessity, showing how households turned indulgence into sustenance. The flavors of cinnamon, nutmeg, and sweet roots lingered, making mornings brighter even when other meals were sparse. Eating pie for breakfast symbolized both frugality and comfort, a way of preserving energy and spirit in difficult times. Leftover pie for breakfast became a fond memory for many, a dish that reflected resilience and the creativity of stretching food in every way possible. Rice pudding for breakfast was what happened when thrift met tenderness. Leftover rice was never wasted. It was reborn in a pot of milk, sugar, and cinnamon, simmered until thick and creamy. The scent filled the house, sweet and comforting, wrapping around sleepy mornings like a hug. Sometimes raisins were stirred in, sometimes a knob of butter melted on top, adding richness to every spoonful. It was warm, gentle food, soft enough for the old, sweet enough for the young, and filling enough for everyone in between. It turned scraps into comfort, simplicity into delight. A bowl of rice pudding meant care. It meant someone thought ahead to make sure nothing was wasted and no one went hungry. Served with a sprinkle of nutmeg or a drizzle of cream, it tasted like home itself. Some families made it thin, like porridge, while others baked it into custard, letting the top brown just slightly. Every spoonful carried the quiet reassurance that even the plainest ingredients could become something memorable. It was proof that love could be stirred, not spoken, and that warmth often came in the simplest bowl. Grits and scrambled eggs were the foundation of the Southern morning. Grandparents stirred the grits slow, keeping them smooth and thick while eggs cooked soft and golden beside them. The smell of butter, salt, and heat filled the air, a smell that meant the day was beginning right. The two foods shared a plate, one creamy, one fluffy, both symbols of care. It was quick, affordable, and enough to keep the family full until noon. Sometimes a slice of bacon or a spoon of gravy joined the dish, but even plain, it felt whole. This was the meal of workers, of early risers and hopeful hearts. Every bite was steady, warm, and simple, a reminder that the best things in life often came from the smallest pots. The rhythm of whisking grits and scrambling eggs was morning music, soft and sure. It was eaten before the day's labor began, giving strength and calm in equal measure. Each bowl held a quiet promise that even in struggle, Comfort could always be found at the table. Fried salmon patties for breakfast might seem unusual today, but for many African American families in the 60s and 70s, canned salmon was a dependable pantry staple that worked for any meal of the day. Grandparents mixed the salmon with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasoning, shaping it into patties that sizzled in the skillet until crisp. The smell filled the kitchen with something hearty and inviting, a bold start to the morning that made you feel ready for whatever the day demanded. Served with grits or biscuits, the patties tasted rich and satisfying, proof that canned ingredients could create meals full of flavor and comfort. Salmon was not expensive, but it felt special, which made breakfast feel special too. Children grew used to that savory taste long before they ever tried a restaurant version. Fried salmon patties were practical, filling, and unforgettable, a reminder of how creativity in the kitchen shaped so many childhood mornings. Rye coffee substitute with toast was born out of scarcity, but it carried warmth into countless mornings. Coffee beans were expensive and often hard to find, so roasted rye grains were brewed instead, producing a hot, bitter drink that resembled coffee. Families paired it with toast made from whatever bread was available, sometimes stale but still sustaining. The ritual of drinking a hot beverage in the morning mattered as much as the food itself, offering comfort before facing long days of uncertainty. Adults leaned on this substitute to keep their routines intact, finding strength in familiarity even without the real thing. Toast added bulk, and sometimes apple butter or syrup was spread on top if there was any to spare. Rye coffee substitute with toast reflected the creativity of families who refused to give up small comforts despite financial strain. It carried both warmth and resolve, fueling people with more than calories. It gave them routine and stability. Homemade buttermilk pancakes were a weekend ritual that stretched across generations. Before box mixes, families mixed their own batter: flour, eggs, buttermilk, and a pinch of soda for lift. The griddle hissed as each ladleful hit the heat, bubbling and browning into golden perfection. They came off in stacks, soft in the center, crisp at the edges, ready for butter and syrup or sometimes just sugar sprinkled on top. Buttermilk gave them their signature tang, the secret that made them taste like home. Mothers and grandmothers flipped them by instinct, never measuring, always knowing by sight when they were done. These pancakes were meant to be shared, piled high in the middle of the table for everyone to grab. They were a reminder that joy could come cheap, that breakfast could be a celebration all on its own. In a world before hurry, this was how mornings were meant to feel. Crackling bread was the sound and taste of tradition. Grandparents saved every pork scrap from butchering, frying them down until crisp. Those cracklings, salty and rich, were folded into cornbread batter that sizzled when it hit the skillet. The smell was deep, smoky, and warm, like comfort made edible. When it came out of the oven, the bread was golden brown, with crunchy bites hidden in every corner. It was heavy but satisfying, each piece holding the spirit of thrift and endurance. Families gathered around to eat it hot, breaking it apart with their hands. It was the kind of food that stretched a meal, that turned a handful of cornmeal and scraps into something filling and proud. Crackling bread was heritage baked into every crumb, a reminder that even the hardest times could taste good when shared together. The sound of the crust cracking filled the kitchen, mingling with laughter and the hum of stories passed down through generations. Every bite carried the memory of hard work, of families who found a way to turn survival into celebration. Served with greens or beans, it stood as proof that nothing from the land was wasted. In that bread lived history, care, and the soul of a people who made every meal mean something. Sorghum syrup on hot biscuits was a rural breakfast tradition rooted in the fields and farms where sorghum was grown and milled long before maple syrup ever became common. The syrup was thick, earthy, and rich, with a sweetness that felt deeper than sugar. Grandparents would split open hot biscuits, steam rising, and drizzle sorghum across the soft center until it glistened. The flavor was bold and comforting, slightly smoky, and entirely unique. It tasted like the land itself, like seasons of harvest, and the steady work of hands that knew how to make every ingredient count. Biscuits with sorghum were inexpensive, filling, and quietly indulgent in their own rustic way. Families loved them because the syrup lasted long, cost little, and carried the taste of home. Even today, those who grew up with sorghum syrup remember its distinct sweetness with a kind of affection that never fades. Catfish and grits gave weekend mornings a soulful edge, pairing crisp fried fish with creamy stone-ground grits in a combination that felt both rustic and celebratory. Fresh river catfish fillets were seasoned with salt, pepper, and a dusting of cornmeal before sliding into hot oil where they sizzled to a golden brown. The grits simmered slowly on the stove, enriched with butter and a touch of cream for a silky texture that balanced the crunch of the fish. Families often gathered around big skillets of catfish on Sundays after church, turning breakfast into a communal event. Some added a squeeze of lemon or a dash of hot sauce to brighten the flavors, while others served sliced tomatoes or greens on the side. Catfish and grits carried the heritage of southern waterways and the ingenuity of African-American cooks who transformed local catches into a beloved morning feast that satisfied hunger and celebrated the bounty of rivers and farms alike. Scalded cornmeal porridge was one of the simplest breakfasts, but it was dependable and nourishing in every season. Cornmeal was whisked into boiling water, then enriched with a splash of milk if available, turning into a smooth, hot cereal. It was plain but filling, eaten with a little molasses, sugar, or even just salt depending on what a family had. Children grew up with bowls of it before heading to school, and adults leaned on it for early morning labor. The dish carried an earthy flavor that became familiar, tied to the smell of steaming pots in family kitchens. It was cheap to prepare and stretched far, making it a perfect meal during lean years. Scalded cornmeal porridge was proof that even the most basic ingredients could sustain life when nothing else was available. It became one of those dishes remembered with both fondness and respect, a reminder of perseverance and the strength found in simple foods. Grapefruit with sugar and a broiled topping was the picture of mid-century sophistication, elegant yet born of practicality. Halved grapefruit was sprinkled with sugar and broiled just long enough for the top to bubble and brown, creating a caramelized glaze that softened the tartness beneath. Served in its own rind with a little spoon, it looked like something from a hotel breakfast tray. Housewives loved it because it felt fancy but cost almost nothing. The heat mellowed the fruit, making it warm and fragrant, the sugar turning into a crisp, golden shell. It was light, refreshing, and surprisingly indulgent for something so simple. For a generation discovering convenience and presentation, this dish was breakfast theater. Grapefruit with sugar was more than fruit. It was optimism, the taste of a new kind of morning when simplicity could still feel special. Some families added a drizzle of honey or a sprinkle of cinnamon for extra warmth, while others topped it with a cherry for flair. It became a symbol of modern homemaking, polished, easy, and delightful to the eye. The broiled grapefruit was as much about beauty as flavor, proof that even the simplest fruit could feel luxurious when given a moment of care. Cornmeal pancakes were the breakfast that never failed to satisfy. When flour ran low, grandparents reached for cornmeal, mixing it with water, a pinch of salt, and whatever fat they had saved. The batter was thick and hearty, poured into a skillet greased with bacon drippings or lard. Each pancake came out golden and crisp at the edges, with a dense, warm center that held the taste of home. Syrup, molasses, or even a sprinkle of sugar made them sweet, but they were just as good plain. The smell of frying cornmeal filled the house, comforting and familiar, the sound of a day beginning right. Kids gathered around the table, forks ready, while grandparents flipped each one with practiced rhythm. Cornmeal pancakes were more than breakfast. They were survival turned soft and golden. In every bite was a story of making do, of turning simple things into something you could be proud to serve. Hot water cornbread breakfast cakes were the quick morning version of a beloved staple that had already lived lifetimes in African-American kitchens. A bowl of cornmeal mixed with boiling water created a dough that came together almost instantly, proving that good food did not need complicated steps or expensive supplies. Grandparents shaped the dough with their hands, patting each cake gently before laying it into the skillet where it sizzled and tightened into a crisp golden edge. These smaller breakfast cakes were eaten warm, often with a smear of jam, a drizzle of honey, or just a little butter melting across the top. The texture was dense but soft, hearty but still light enough to enjoy early in the morning. It tasted like home, like tradition, like something passed down not through written recipes but through practiced hands that knew exactly how the batter should feel. These cakes made mornings easier, faster, and far more delicious than anyone expected from such simple ingredients. Children loved them because they felt like little treats, bite-sized comforts that fit perfectly into small hands. Adults loved them because they stretched the pantry and kept everyone fed without fuss or cost. Hot water cornbread breakfast cakes were proof that a skillet, some cornmeal, and a steady hand could create something unforgettable day after day. Buttermilk biscuits with cane syrup brought the warm fragrance of the Southern kitchen to every African-American breakfast table in the 1970s, where weekend mornings began with the sound of dough being patted and folded by hand. The biscuits rose tall and flaky as they baked in heavy pans, their buttery layers puffing into golden clouds. Cane syrup, boiled from freshly pressed sugarcane juice, added a deep, smoky sweetness that no ordinary syrup could match. Families kept jars of the thick amber syrup in the pantry, ready to drizzle over steaming biscuits straight from the oven. Some cooks stirred a little butter into the syrup for a glossy glaze, while others left it pure and strong to balance the biscuit's delicate crumb. This simple pairing carried memories of family farms, Sunday gatherings, and the strength of generations who turned humble ingredients into unforgettable flavor. Buttermilk biscuits with cane syrup proved that the simplest foods, treated with care, could turn an ordinary morning into a celebration of heritage and home. Onion and potato hash cakes were one of those breakfasts that always felt hearty, even without meat. Potatoes and onions were grated, mixed with flour or cornmeal, and fried into crisp patties that could be eaten plain or with hot sauce if available. The dish was cheap, easy to prepare, and could stretch across several plates, making it ideal for large households. It was often made in the early mornings before children headed to school or adults to long shifts at work. The taste was simple but filling, a combination of flavors that became closely tied to daily life in tough years. Families leaned on it not only for its thrift, but for the comfort it gave in the face of uncertainty. Onion and potato hash cakes fueled countless mornings of determination, carrying people through struggles outside the kitchen. They became a dish remembered not just for their flavor, but for their role in sustaining courage and community. Poached eggs on toast were breakfast elegance in a world that rarely had time for it. Water simmered just below boiling, and eggs were lowered gently, their whites curling around the yolks like soft silk. When lifted out and set on buttered toast, they gleamed, tender, trembling, and perfect. A sprinkle of salt and pepper was all it needed. It was a dish that made even a modest kitchen feel refined. The first cut of the knife released a golden stream that soaked into the bread, rich and warm. This breakfast carried a sense of calm, the quiet kind that came before a day's labor. Grandparents who made poached eggs treated it like a ritual, never rushed, always patient. It was proof that even in lean times, beauty could live on the breakfast plate. Poached eggs on toast weren't about luxury. They were about intention, about giving the morning the dignity it deserved. Potato hash with onions and peppers was the morning's miracle made from scraps. Grandparents diced leftover boiled potatoes, tossing them into a skillet slick with grease. Onions and peppers joined next, sizzling until soft and golden. The smell rose up, sweet, smoky, and alive. Salt and pepper did the rest, no fancy spices needed. The potatoes crisped at the edges, turning brown and crunchy while the center stayed soft. Served hot with eggs or bread, it filled the room with satisfaction. It was the kind of meal that looked humble but felt whole. You could feed a family on it, stretch it for another day, or serve it proudly on Sunday. Potato hash with onions and peppers was proof that waste didn't exist in a wise kitchen. Every bit could be reborn. Every leftover turned into something loved. Sometimes sausage or fatback joined the pan, adding depth and flavor, but the dish never needed more than care. It carried the rhythm of home, the steady scrape of a spatula, the pop of oil, the warmth of shared hunger met with love. Hominy with butter and pepper was the kind of breakfast that lived quietly in the background of many households, long before grits became the default choice. Hominy had a soft bite and a mild flavor that absorbed butter beautifully, turning each spoonful into something warm and soothing. Grandparents would heat it in a pot, stirring in butter until it melted completely, then add black pepper to give it depth and warmth. It was simple, inexpensive, and filling, the kind of breakfast made for mornings when the body needed steady fuel more than excitement. Children often ate it without thinking much about it, unaware that it connected them to older food traditions that stretched back generations. Hominy was a reminder of how African American families made the most of staple ingredients, honoring older methods while building new routines bowl after bowl. It offered comfort that lasted far longer than the meal itself. Pork neck bone and rice turned a humble cut into a deeply flavored breakfast that spoke to generations of resourceful cooking. Meaty pork neck bones were simmered slowly with onions, garlic, and bay leaves until their rich broth infused every grain of rice. The long cooking released tenderness and flavor, transforming inexpensive ingredients into a dish that tasted luxurious. Families often added a pinch of red pepper or a splash of vinegar for brightness, while some stirred in greens for added nourishment. Served steaming hot, pork neck bone and rice offered hearty protein and comforting warmth that fueled long workdays. This meal reflected the African American tradition of using every part of the animal with skill and respect, proving that nothing needed to be wasted to create something memorable. Pork neck bone and rice stood as both sustenance and celebration, a bowl of savory history that reminded everyone at the table of the creativity and strength passed down through kitchens across the South and beyond. Cane syrup biscuits were one of the sweetest ways families could begin a day when sugar was a luxury. Freshly baked biscuits were split open and drizzled with thick cane syrup, a cheaper sweetener that was widely available in the South. This breakfast offered comfort and energy, especially for children heading to school or adults preparing for long days of labor. Cane syrup added richness to otherwise plain bread, transforming simple biscuits into a treat. It was a dish tied directly to the land, since cane syrup came from local harvests and represented self-reliance. Families treasured it because it gave sweetness without breaking the budget, a rare indulgence during lean times. Cane syrup biscuits became more than breakfast. They were symbols of hope, resourcefulness, and the sweetness people clung to even in struggle. The dish carried both nourishment and spirit, helping fuel resilience during mornings that demanded strength. For many, it was the taste of home and perseverance. Fried cornmeal cakes were the working man's pancakes, crisp at the edges, tender in the middle, and made from the same cornmeal that showed up at every Southern table. Mixed with milk, eggs, and a little salt, the batter went into a hot skillet and came out golden and bubbling. They could be eaten plain or drizzled with syrup, honey, or even a little molasses depending on what was in the pantry. The smell of frying cornmeal was unmistakable, sweet and nutty, a scent that meant comfort was close. These cakes filled stomachs and hearts alike, simple enough for every day but special enough to remember. They were the breakfast of farmers, laborers, and children who learned that love came in humble servings. Fried cornmeal cakes didn't just feed, they fortified, reminding everyone that a good day started with something made by hand. Leftover rice pancakes were the invention of hungry mornings. Cold rice mixed with flour, egg, and a little sugar turned into batter, then fried into soft golden cakes. They crisped at the edges and steamed in the center, smelling like comfort reborn. Grandparents drizzled syrup or butter over the top, calling it a special breakfast even when it was born from scraps. The pancakes were sweet and tender, their warmth stretching far beyond the plate. Every bite carried gratitude, a quiet celebration of resourcefulness that turned leftovers into joy. The sound of the batter hitting the skillet was soft but sure, like morning routine meeting creativity. The first pancake was always eaten standing at the stove, still hot, still bubbling with syrup. It tasted like invention, like pride disguised as sweetness. It was survival dressed up as a treat, and it never failed to bring a smile. Fried fatback with biscuits was the kind of breakfast that came from deep tradition, from years when every part of the animal was used and nothing was taken for granted. Before bacon became the breakfast standard, fatback was the salty, sizzling star of the morning. Grandparents sliced it thick and fried it until the edges crisped and curled, releasing a savory aroma that filled the whole house. The drippings soaked into fresh biscuits, turning them into something rich and flavorful without needing butter or gravy. The combination was simple but powerful. A pairing that carried families through long days of labor, and school fatback was inexpensive, accessible, and packed with flavor, which made it a natural choice for rural homes and city kitchens alike. Children grew up associating that salty crunch with mornings spent around crowded tables, hands reaching for biscuits still warm from the oven. Even though fatback is rarely seen in modern breakfast routines, the memory of it remains strong for those who grew up with its bold taste. It represents a time when meals came from resourcefulness, from tradition, and from knowing how to make the most of what you had. Salmon croquettes with grits turned pantry staples into a breakfast feast that felt both luxurious and familiar across African American communities of the 1970s. Canned salmon was flaked into a bowl with onions, breadcrumbs, and a little seasoning, then shaped into neat patties ready for the skillet. As they fried, the croquettes developed a crisp golden crust while staying moist inside, their aroma mingling with the gentle steam of creamy stone-ground grits bubbling nearby. This pairing brought together the coastal traditions of the South and the practicality of modern kitchens, where canned fish kept well and stretched to feed a family. Some cooks added a squeeze of lemon or a pinch of cayenne for extra brightness and heat, while others folded in fresh herbs from backyard gardens. Served with a side of sliced tomatoes or greens, salmon croquettes with grits delivered protein, comfort, and a taste of heritage, showing how everyday ingredients could be elevated into a soulful breakfast worth savoring. Cold cornbread and milk was often called the poor man's cereal, but it was more than a label. It was a lifeline. Day-old cornbread, often too dry to eat on its own, was crumbled into bowls and covered with milk or buttermilk, creating a filling meal that could be eaten quickly before school or work. For children, it was breakfast. For adults, it was sometimes supper, proving its versatility. It carried a tangy, comforting flavor that became familiar in many Southern households. What made it special was not the taste alone, but the reminder that nothing was wasted, not even stale bread. In communities with little to spare, this dish represented survival and practicality. Cold cornbread and milk was part of the rhythm of daily life, a dish that carried generations through hard times and into mornings of determination. Even with its simplicity, it gave people what they needed to keep going during days that demanded courage and endurance. Hot grits with butter and salt were the backbone of countless Southern mornings, a dish so simple yet so sacred that no table felt complete without it. Made from ground hominy simmered until smooth, grits were the definition of patience rewarded. They needed time, stirring, and a steady hand to reach the perfect texture. Not too thick, not too thin, just creamy enough to coat a spoon. A pat of butter on top melted into golden swirls, and a pinch of salt brought everything to life. This was food made for strength, for those who worked in fields, factories, or kitchens from dawn to dusk. It was nourishment that filled the belly and steadied the spirit. Children learned early how to stir the pot, to keep the grits from clumping, to treat the meal with the respect it deserved. Some added milk, some cheese, some even sugar, but pure grits with butter and salt needed nothing more. It was more than breakfast. It was a ritual of care and endurance. In a world that moved fast, this bowl forced you to slow down and savor the quiet. Fried salt pork and gravy was breakfast born from preservation and patience. Grandparents sliced the cured meat thin, sizzling it in a skillet until the fat turned crisp and fragrant. The salty aroma filled the air, sharp but comforting. The leftover drippings stayed in the pan, thickened with flour and water to make a gravy that stretched across biscuits or grits. It was heavy, hearty, and enough to fuel long days of work. Every piece of pork carried the taste of tradition, food made to last, food that respected every scrap. The gravy was creamy and rich, coating the plate like warmth itself. Children wiped their plates clean with biscuits, unwilling to waste even a drop. It was not fancy, but it was full of care, a reminder that flavor could rise from necessity. In that skillet, hardship turned into something nourishing, something that said, "We made it through another morning." Stewed apples over grits was the quiet morning comfort many families turned to when fresh fruit was limited, but preserved apples were always within reach. Grandparents would slice apples thin and let them simmer with sugar or syrup until they softened into a fragrant golden mixture that tasted like fall in every season. Meanwhile, a pot of grits bubbled on the stove, thickening slowly as it absorbed the heat. When the stewed apples were spooned over the top, the contrast of creamy grits and sweet fruit felt like a small luxury. It was warm, filling, and gentle, the kind of breakfast that soothed the stomach and the spirit. Some families added cinnamon, others added butter, but most kept it simple because the apples were already sweet enough. This dish was a reminder of home orchards, backyard trees, and jars of preserves lined up on pantry shelves. It tasted like patience and tradition, like the kind of mornings where time moved slower. Even today, stewed apples over grits feels like a forgotten treasure from a quieter time. Hot water cornbread patties delivered the satisfying crunch of cast iron frying to countless Delta kitchens, where cornmeal was as common as morning sun. Cooks stirred hot water into fine cornmeal until the mixture held together, then shaped it by hand and slid it into shimmering oil. The patties sizzled and crisped, forming a browned crust that gave way to a tender interior. The method required no milk or eggs, only the steady skill of a practiced hand, making it accessible and quick. Families ate these cornbread rounds with eggs, greens, or a simple drizzle of honey when sugar was scarce. In many homes, the sound of batter hitting hot oil signaled breakfast was ready, filling the air with the nutty aroma of toasting corn. Hot water cornbread patties celebrated resourcefulness and flavor, reminding everyone that the best dishes often came from the simplest combinations of grain, heat, and love, passed down through generations of African-American cooks. Eggless mayonnaise biscuits were one of those recipes that came out of necessity, but lingered in kitchens long after shortages eased. Families discovered that a spoonful of mayonnaise could stand in for eggs and fat, binding dough into soft, fluffy biscuits without using precious rationed ingredients. During the Civil Rights era, this recipe stuck around because it was practical and affordable, perfect for households where money and supplies were always stretched thin. Mothers could bake a tray in the morning, serving them plain, with syrup, or alongside whatever small scraps were available. Children often carried leftovers in their pockets to school, eating them between lessons for a bit of comfort and energy. The taste was familiar and reliable, even if the origins came from harder times. Eggless mayonnaise biscuits symbolized more than just thrift. They carried the determination to keep families fed through resourcefulness. They became a quiet staple on breakfast tables that fueled long days of work, activism, and resilience. Fried apples and biscuits turned simple fruit into a morning celebration. Apples were sliced thin, tossed into a skillet of melted butter and dusted with sugar until they softened and gleamed like caramel. The smell alone was enough to draw everyone to the table. Served warm beside soft biscuits, the apples made their own syrup, sticky and golden, perfect for spooning or dipping. It was the sort of breakfast that reminded families that sweetness did not have to come from fancy ingredients. It could come from what grew in their own backyard. Sometimes cinnamon or nutmeg found its way into the pan, giving each bite a touch of warmth that lingered. Fried apples and biscuits were especially loved in fall when orchards overflowed and waste was never an option. Grandparents knew how to stretch everything: a few apples, a bit of butter, and the will to make something memorable. This dish was their way of turning simplicity into comfort, of teaching that care was the secret ingredient in any meal. It was nostalgia on a plate, sweet, soft, and glowing, like a memory you could taste. Biscuits and molasses turned scarcity into sweetness. When butter ran out and sugar was too expensive, thick molasses became the spread that kept breakfast alive. Grandparents baked biscuits from scratch, using lard instead of butter, rolling and cutting dough on floured tables. The smell of baking bread filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of molasses waiting in its jar. Each biscuit came out golden, soft on the inside, and ready to soak up that dark, syrupy sweetness. It was a meal that cost almost nothing but tasted like everything. Families sat together, dipping biscuits, talking slow, and savoring the quiet start to their day. The sticky sweetness clung to fingers and memories alike. For those who grew up with little, biscuits and molasses were proof that even poverty could taste rich when shared with love. How cakes with butter and sugar were the sweet breakfast treat that felt almost like dessert, even though they came from the simplest ingredients in the pantry. Made from cornmeal batter poured onto a hot skillet, each cake sizzled as it spread, forming a crisp edge and soft center that tasted perfect every single time grandparents would flip them with practiced ease, stacking them high and spreading butter that melted instantly into the warm surface. A sprinkle of sugar added just enough sweetness to make the hoe cakes feel like a special morning indulgence. They were quick, affordable, and comforting. The kind of food that made children sit down fast and quiet at the table. Hoe cakes were history and home all at once, a dish born from necessity that became a beloved tradition. Even now, the memory of that buttery sweetness lingers in the minds of anyone lucky enough to grow up with them. Sweet potato pancakes brought earthy sweetness and warm spice to kitchen tables, blending mashed sweet potatoes with cinnamon, nutmeg, and a splash of milk. The batter sizzled as it hit the griddle, releasing a fragrance that filled the room with comfort. Each cake browned to a gentle crisp outside while remaining moist and tender within, offering natural sweetness without the need for heavy syrup. Many families grew their own sweet potatoes, making these pancakes a natural way to use the harvest through cooler months. Some cooks stirred in chopped pecans for a nutty crunch, while others added a hint of ginger for extra warmth. Served with a dollop of butter or a drizzle of cane syrup, sweet potato pancakes became a Saturday morning favorite, reminding everyone of autumn fields and family traditions. This dish honored the African-American love for root vegetables and the creativity of home cooks who turned humble ingredients into breakfast plates bursting with flavor and cultural memory. Cracklin' cornbread was a dish that brought a little joy and extra nourishment to the table, especially during times of struggle. Made by folding pork cracklings into traditional cornbread batter, it added both protein and crunch to a meal that was usually simple. Pork skins and fat were cheap and rarely wasted, and incorporating them into cornbread gave households a way to make breakfast more sustaining. Served hot from the skillet, cracklin' cornbread was filling enough to carry families through demanding days. It became a staple for marches, farm work, or long hours in factories, offering both flavor and strength. Children remembered the satisfying crunch, while adults valued the resourcefulness that turned scraps into sustenance. Cracklin' cornbread reflected a deeper story about resilience, showing how families took pride in making the most of what they had. More than just food, it symbolized unity at the table and fuel for the struggles ahead, keeping spirits alive through its warmth and heartiness. Molasses on hot biscuits was the taste of sweetness earned through patience. When sugar was expensive or hard to find, molasses filled the gap, dark, thick, and full of depth. Hot biscuits came out of the oven steaming, split open by hand, and dripping with butter before a spoonful of molasses turned them into something heavenly. The syrup pooled and soaked into the soft crumb, leaving behind a shine that caught the morning light. It was sticky on the fingers, rich on the tongue, and comforting in a way only handmade food can be. For many, it was the only sweet treat of the day, but that never made it ordinary. The flavor was bold, smoky, and deep. A reminder of cane fields, wood stoves, and family hands passing down recipes without a word written. Molasses on biscuits was the kind of breakfast that could make even the hardest morning feel gentle again. In the simplest kitchens, where nothing was wasted and every crumb mattered, this pairing stood as a small luxury, proof that joy could come from the humblest of ingredients. Hot water. Cornbread was the taste of resilience fried golden. Made from cornmeal, salt, and boiling water, it took almost nothing to prepare, just heat, hands, and a little patience. Grandparents mixed it until thick, shaped small patties and dropped them into sizzling oil. The kitchen filled with that sound, soft crackles and promise. The outside crisped brown, the inside stayed tender, and the smell of corn filled the air. Served hot with greens, beans, or on its own, it was both bread and meal. It was the working person's comfort, made quick and eaten proud. No milk, no eggs, no fancy tools, just skill passed down through hands that refused to give up. Each bite was a memory of endurance, of turning a few ingredients into a reason to keep going. Cornbread and buttermilk cups were the kind of breakfast that felt both rustic and comforting, the sort of meal grandparents made without measuring or fuss because they had been doing it their whole lives. Leftover cornbread never went to waste, not when it could be crumbled into a bowl and soaked in cold buttermilk until the pieces softened but kept just enough texture to make each bite interesting. The tang of the buttermilk balanced the slight sweetness of the cornbread, creating a flavor that felt simple yet deeply satisfying. Some families added a spoonful of sugar, others preferred it plain, but either way, it tasted like something honest and nourishing. It was a breakfast built for long days, a quick way to fill stomachs without spending money or time. Children who grew up on it remember the chilly shock of the buttermilk, the softness of the crumbs, and the quiet pleasure of eating something that required no stove at all. It tasted like tradition handed down through memory rather than recipes, a meal tied to rural kitchens, hardworking families, and morning routines shaped by practicality. Even today, people who try it for the first time often describe it as unexpectedly comforting, like discovering a forgotten piece of their own history. Cornbread and buttermilk cups might seem humble, but in the hands of grandparents, they became something far richer than the ingredients suggested. Molasses oatmeal filled kitchens with the deep aroma of blackstrap sweetness, offering an iron-rich start that was both frugal and indulgent. Old-fashioned oats simmered slowly in milk or water until creamy, then received a generous spoonful of thick sorghum or blackstrap molasses. The dark syrup melted into the oats, tinting them a warm brown and adding a flavor both smoky and sweet. Many families used molasses not only for its taste, but also for its mineral strength, a natural source of iron and energy. Some sprinkled chopped nuts or sliced bananas on top for extra texture, while others added a pinch of cinnamon for gentle spice. Molasses oatmeal spoke to a time when nourishment and economy were equally important, turning a humble grain into a breakfast that felt rich and sustaining. It remained a quiet favorite of African American households, a reminder that even the simplest bowls could carry history, health, and the comforting weight of tradition with every spoonful. Canned mackerel with eggs was one of those breakfasts that filled the house with a smell you never forgot, bold and rich, the kind of scent that told you someone was cooking with purpose. Grandparents used canned mackerel because it was inexpensive, packed with protein, and always waiting in the pantry when fresh meat was not an option. They would open the can, drain the fish, and flake it into a skillet with onions or peppers if they had them. Then came the eggs, cracked right over the fish and stirred until everything blended into a savory scramble that tasted far more filling than it looked. It was a hardworking breakfast, meant to fuel long days, and it carried a flavor that felt deeply tied to the kitchens of older generations. Children growing up on it did not always understand how thrifty it was, only that it tasted warm, smoky, and strangely comforting. First thing in the morning, the mackerel gave the dish a richness, the eggs softened it, and together they made something cheap but unforgettable. Even today, people who grew up with canned mackerel and eggs describe it as a meal that tasted like family resourcefulness at its finest. It was a reminder that nourishing food did not need to be fancy to be good. Skillet cornbread with cracklings combined the golden crunch of cornmeal with the savory richness of pork, delivering a breakfast that satisfied both hunger and nostalgia. Coarse cornmeal was mixed with buttermilk, eggs, and baking powder, then poured into a hot cast-iron skillet lined with sizzling bacon fat. Into this batter went crispy pork cracklings, their salty flavor infusing the bread as it baked to a deep golden brown. The cracklings provided chewy, savory bursts that contrasted beautifully with the tender crumb of the cornbread. Served in thick wedges, it paired perfectly with greens, eggs, or a simple drizzle of honey. This recipe honored the African-American tradition of using every part of the hog, wasting nothing while maximizing flavor. Skillet cornbread with cracklings stood as a reminder that resourcefulness could produce incredible taste, making a simple grain-based bread feel like a luxurious treat that filled the kitchen with a smell impossible to forget. Wild berry syrup on biscuits was a dish that connected people to the land around them. Families foraged for blackberries, muscadines, or other wild berries when money for store-bought sugar was scarce. The berries were boiled down into thick syrups, which were then poured generously over biscuits hot from the oven. This simple act turned foraging into a memory of sweetness, tying hard times to small joys. Children especially looked forward to berry syrup, savoring the rare taste of fruit in seasons when fresh produce was otherwise out of reach. Adults valued it as a resourceful way of providing variety without spending money. Wild berry syrup on biscuits carried with it the taste of summer, the memory of hands stained purple from picking, and the resilience of communities who found sweetness in the fields and woods. It was survival made delicious, a reminder that even in scarcity, families could still find ways to savor life's small pleasures. Cornmeal mush with maple syrup was proof that humble food could still feel like luxury. The cornmeal simmered low and slow until thick, its subtle sweetness waiting beneath the surface. Poured into bowls, it became creamy comfort. Chilled overnight and fried, it became something new. Either way, a drizzle of maple syrup transformed it completely, golden, fragrant, and warm. It was the taste of patience rewarded, of kitchens that made the most out of little. Grandparents ate it without complaint. Children learned to love it without realizing it was born from necessity. The syrup soaked into every bite, blending with the corn's earthiness until it became something deeply satisfying. In hard times, it was survival. In better ones, it was nostalgia. Cornmeal mush reminded families that gratitude could be sweet, especially when poured warm from a jug and shared around the table. Some cooks stirred in butter or milk to make it richer, while others poured it into loaf pans and sliced it for frying the next day. It was a dish that shifted effortlessly between breakfast and supper, proof that versatility was the heart of thrift. The sound of it frying in a skillet, the scent of corn and syrup mingling in the air, it all spoke of comfort. Cornmeal mush was a quiet triumph, a reminder that even the plainest ingredients could carry grace. Rice and fatback gravy turned scraps into satisfaction. The fatback sizzled first, crisping into deep flavor as the grease melted down. Grandparents added flour, then water, whisking until the gravy thickened and darkened to perfection. Poured over rice, it became a meal that was cheap but felt rich. The salt from the fatback gave life to every grain, the smell strong enough to bring everyone to the kitchen. It was the kind of breakfast that didn't need talking, just eating, slow and thankful. It stretched what little there was, filling the air with warmth and the stomach with peace. Every spoonful told a story of survival through skill and patience. Sometimes the gravy was made with leftover drippings from the night before, deepened with onion or pepper if they had it. Grandparents said the secret was in the stirring, slow, steady, and full of intention. Each bite was a memory of endurance, a reminder that flavor was born from effort, not wealth. Peanut butter and corn syrup sandwiches were the kind of breakfast you could throw together in seconds, a heavy, sticky, sweet combination that kept kids full for hours. Grandparents spread thick peanut butter on soft sandwich bread and drizzled corn syrup over it, letting the syrup sink into the peanut butter until the whole thing clung together in a dense, satisfying bite. It was quick, cheap, and strong enough to carry a child through school mornings when there was no time for hot food. The sweetness blended with the saltiness of the peanut butter, creating a flavor that felt indulgent even though it came from pantry staples. Working households relied on this breakfast because it was dependable, affordable, and guaranteed to quiet hunger. Children loved its candy-like richness, even if the adults knew it was simply the best option available. Peanut butter and corn syrup sandwiches were a reminder of mornings shaped by love, necessity, and whatever ingredients were within reach. Cocoa powder porridge was a rare treat for children, transforming a simple breakfast into something sweet and comforting. Hot cereal, made from cornmeal or oats, was flavored with a spoonful of cocoa powder whisked into the pot. The cocoa gave it a richness and sweetness that brightened mornings, even when sugar was scarce. Families leaned on this dish as a way to bring joy to children during hard times, ensuring that breakfast carried not only nutrition, but happiness. For adults, it was a reminder of small indulgences made possible through creativity. Cocoa powder porridge was not common, but when it appeared, it was cherished and remembered. It symbolized resilience, the way families found ways to stretch the smallest luxuries into meaningful experiences. Even decades later, people recalled it with fondness, a dish that turned struggle into memory. Cocoa powder porridge was survival with sweetness, the kind of food that stayed alive in the hearts of those who ate it. Peach preserves on hot biscuits was sunshine captured in a jar. Ripe peaches cooked down with sugar until golden and thick, the scent filling the kitchen like summer itself. Spread onto a steaming biscuit straight from the oven, the preserves melted into the crumb, seeping sweetness into every bite. It was sticky, messy, and utterly perfect. Grandmothers kept shelves lined with jars, each one a memory of fruit picked by hand and simmered slow. Those preserves were more than food. They were love saved for later, waiting for a cold morning to brighten. A biscuit topped with peach preserves was more than breakfast. It was a reminder that summer could be tasted even in the heart of winter. Families gathered around the table as the golden syrup dripped from fingers and laughter filled the air. Some added a pat of butter before spreading the preserves, letting the heat make everything glossy and rich. Every jar represented care, the patience to peel, stir, and seal by hand. The first taste always brought back long afternoons of harvest, of baskets heavy with peaches and sunlight. Peach preserves on biscuits were a bridge between seasons, a bite of warmth that carried through the year. Homemade syrup biscuits were the dessert of lean times, a sweetness that came from patience, not price. The biscuits were soft and warm, baked from scratch on mornings when life felt heavy. Grandparents made syrup by simmering brown sugar and water together until it bubbled thick like honey. The smell alone could lift a tired heart. When poured over hot biscuits, the syrup soaked in, glistening like amber. Kids would press their fingers into the bread, catching the drips before they cooled. It was sticky, messy, and wonderful. A treat that felt special even without anything store-bought. Homemade syrup biscuits turned necessity into celebration, a tradition passed through generations. Each bite tasted like care, sweetened by the effort it took to make something from nothing. The syrup shimmered in the morning light, a small reminder that sweetness could survive even in struggle. Every plate carried comfort, laughter, and the quiet joy of making the most out of little. Leftover fish and grits were a breakfast that turned yesterday's dinner into something new and comforting. Grandparents knew better than to waste good fried fish, and reheating it in the morning gave the house a rich, savory smell that made everyone wander toward the kitchen. The fish was warmed gently, keeping the crust crisp, then served alongside a bowl of buttery grits that balanced the strong flavor with something soft and smooth. It was a combination rooted in coastal and southern traditions, where fish was common and grits were always waiting in the pantry. Children grew up thinking nothing of fish for breakfast, tasting the salty crunch next to the warm creaminess of the grits. It was hearty, practical, and filling, the kind of breakfast that made you ready for a full day's work or school. Even today, one bite can transport people back to kitchens where cast iron pans never cooled and breakfast tasted like the continuation of joy from the night before. Buttered hominy with bacon brought a smoky, buttery aroma to African American breakfast tables of the 1970s, turning a humble grain into something rich and satisfying. White hominy kernels were simmered until tender, then sautéed in a heavy skillet with generous pats of butter. Crumbled strips of crisp bacon were folded in at the end, their savory fat blending with the buttery corn for layers of flavor. Some cooks added a sprinkle of black pepper or a pinch of red pepper flakes to deepen the taste, while others stirred in chopped green onions for brightness. Served alongside scrambled eggs or spooned over fresh cornbread, it offered hearty comfort that stuck with you through the morning. Buttered hominy with bacon celebrated both farm tradition and kitchen creativity, honoring a food once central to Native American diets and embraced by Southern cooks. Each bite carried the essence of smoky bacon and sweet corn, proving that simple, affordable ingredients could create a breakfast that felt luxurious without being complicated or costly. Fried chicken neck with biscuits was another way families made use of overlooked cuts of poultry. Necks were cheap, flavorful, and could be fried crisp, then served alongside fresh biscuits for a sustaining breakfast. The meat was small but savory, and paired with biscuits, it created a meal that felt hearty despite its thrift. Families appreciated it because it ensured that no part of the bird was wasted, stretching poultry into multiple meals. Children remembered picking the meat from the bones, while adults valued the fat and flavor that carried into the biscuits. Fried chicken neck with biscuits was more than just food. It was an expression of resourcefulness. It provided both protein and comfort, fueling families for demanding days of work or marches. This dish symbolized resilience, showing how households turned scraps into sustenance without losing pride. Fried chicken neck with biscuits was a taste of perseverance, remembered as one of the breakfasts that carried people through struggle. Homemade donuts were a labor of love long before convenience ever came in a box. Families mixed flour, eggs, milk, and a little sugar by hand, rolling the dough on floured tables before cutting perfect rings. The oil had to be just right, hot enough to bubble but not burn, and the kitchen filled with the smell of sweetness meeting heat. Each donut puffed up golden and soft, kissed with crispness at the edges. Once drained, they were rolled in sugar or dipped in glaze, still warm and tender. Children waited eagerly, dusting their fingers in sugar while stealing the first taste. These weren't store-bought treats. They were handmade rewards, crafted slowly on quiet mornings. A batch of donuts meant love, celebration, or simply the joy of having enough ingredients to spare. They were simple yet sacred, proof that happiness could be fried and shared. Some cooks made holes into tiny donut balls, frying them as munchkins before the name ever existed. Others flavored the dough with nutmeg or a splash of buttermilk for tang. The smell of homemade donuts lingered like a song through the house, reminding everyone that effort and sweetness often went hand in hand. Homemade biscuits with cane syrup were a breakfast of pride, born from hands that worked and loved without rest. Grandparents woke early, sifting flour, cutting in lard, and rolling out dough on wooden tables dusted with years of memory. The smell of baking filled the house, the warmth spilling into every room. When the biscuits came out, golden and steaming, the cane syrup waited nearby, thick and dark as molasses. It poured slow, catching the morning light like honey turned to amber. The sweetness mixed with the salt of the biscuit, creating comfort too deep to describe. It was the kind of meal that made you pause before the first bite, because it tasted like home. Every batch told a story, of mothers who made do, of children who grew up strong on simplicity. There was joy in its repetition, in the rhythm of making something real from so little. The meal said, "We might not have much, but we have each other," and that was enough. The sound of the oven door closing, the clink of a butter knife, the hush that followed the first bite, all of it became part of the morning ritual. That biscuit, soft on the inside and crisp at the edge, carried warmth that lasted long after breakfast ended. It was the taste of love baked daily, patient and proud. Scrapple slices were one of the most resourceful breakfasts older generations relied on, especially in regions where nothing from the pig went to waste. Scrapple mixed pork scraps with cornmeal and spices, forming a loaf that could be sliced and fried until crisp on the outside and soft on the inside. Grandparents cooked it in a hot skillet, letting each piece form that perfect golden crust that crackled slightly under the fork. It was savory, hearty, and deeply rooted in tradition, a dish born from the idea that every ingredient had value. Some families ate it plain, others added syrup or mustard, but no matter how it was served, scrapple had a distinctive flavor that stayed with you. It tasted like farm mornings, like smoke rising from cast iron pans, like a time when food came from skill rather than convenience. Children might turn up their noses at the idea today, but to those who grew up on it, scrapple was a breakfast that meant strength, thrift, and the comfort of knowing a meal would always be there. Even now, the memory of that sizzling sound brings people back to early mornings in small kitchens where tradition guided the skillet. Creole shrimp omelet brought the rich flavors of the Gulf Coast to morning tables, folding tender shrimp and fresh scallions into fluffy eggs seasoned with paprika and a touch of cayenne. Shrimp were quickly sautéed with butter and garlic until just pink, then combined with beaten eggs and poured into a hot skillet. As the omelet puffed, the seafood infused the eggs with a briny sweetness that spoke of Louisiana waters. Some cooks added diced bell peppers or a spoonful of tomato sauce for extra color and depth, while others finished with a squeeze of lemon. This breakfast balanced elegance and everyday comfort, reflecting African-American culinary ties to coastal Creole traditions. Families savored the dish on special weekends or when fresh shrimp were plentiful, making breakfast feel like a celebration. The Creole shrimp omelet captured the spirit of New Orleans and the surrounding Gulf, proving that a simple egg dish could deliver vibrant flavor and a taste of Southern heritage before the day began. Cornbread and buttermilk in a bowl was breakfast in its purest, humblest form. Yesterday's cornbread, crumbled and covered with cold buttermilk, became something both refreshing and filling. The texture was soft yet hearty, the tang of buttermilk cutting through the sweetness of the corn. It was eaten straight from the bowl, sometimes with a spoon, sometimes with a piece of bread to scoop it up. To some, it was comfort food. To others, it was necessity. But for everyone who grew up with it, it was memory of grandparents who never wasted a crumb and knew how to make even the plainest food taste right. It was a dish that belonged to no one and everyone at once, simple enough to make but impossible to forget. Cornbread and buttermilk was proof that contentment could live in a single bowl. Sweet potato biscuits brought sunshine into the morning, their golden color glowing like joy itself. Grandparents mashed leftover sweet potatoes into flour, sugar, and a bit of lard, turning scraps into softness. The dough came together with care, rolled out and cut by hand before baking to perfection. The smell that drifted from the oven was sweet, nutty, and full of promise. When pulled apart, the biscuits were tender and bright, sweetened naturally by the potato. No jam was needed, just warmth, butter if it was there, and the pride of making something beautiful from leftovers. Kids would eat them fast, the edges still too hot to touch. It was breakfast that felt like celebration, even on the poorest days. Every bite reminded the family that sweetness could grow from hardship, that nothing given by the earth ever went to waste. The color of the biscuits looked like morning sunlight captured in bread form, glowing against the gray of lean years. Every soft bite spoke of love and cleverness, proof that even scraps could bloom into something whole. It was a kind of quiet victory, one baked, not bought, and shared with joy. Salt pork gravy over bread was one of those breakfasts created from necessity, yet it tasted like something that belonged in a country diner. Grandparents would fry slices of salt pork until the fat rendered out and the meat crisped, releasing a savory aroma that meant a hearty meal was on the way. The drippings were whisked with flour and milk to create a thick, salty gravy that clung to the spoon, rich and filling despite its humble ingredients. Poured over toast or biscuits, it transformed simple bread into something warm and deeply satisfying. This was a breakfast made for long days and empty pockets, a way to stretch flavor as far as it could go. Children did not think about thrift. They just knew the gravy tasted good and made the morning feel special. The saltiness, the creaminess, and the soft bread soaking up every drop created a combination that lingered in both taste and memory. It was the kind of meal that carried families through tough times and still managed to feel generous. Even today, people who grew up with salt pork gravy remember it with a fondness that nothing else can quite match. Country sausage and red pepper gravy turned ordinary biscuits into a feast, combining smoky pork with the sweetness of peppers and onions. Sausage browned slowly in a heavy skillet, releasing drippings that formed the base of a creamy gravy thickened with flour and milk. Strips of red bell pepper and chopped onions simmered in the mixture, lending a vibrant color and a subtle sweetness that balanced the savory richness. Poured over split biscuits or spooned onto grits, the gravy soaked into every layer, ensuring each bite was flavorful and filling. In African American kitchens of the 1970s, this dish represented comfort and abundance, a way to stretch a small amount of meat into a meal for the entire family. Some cooks added a touch of crushed red pepper for gentle heat, while others served sliced tomatoes alongside for freshness. Country sausage and red pepper gravy brought together bold taste and home-style satisfaction, making mornings feel special even on the busiest days. Sweet potato coffee cakes were born of Southern improvisation, where fresh sweet potatoes were mashed into dough to stretch ingredients and add natural sweetness. Families mixed the potatoes with flour, sugar, and spices, creating a dense but moist cake that could be sliced and shared in the mornings. It carried the familiar flavor of sweet potatoes while saving on costly ingredients like butter or eggs. For children, sweet potato coffee cakes often felt like a treat, while adults appreciated the practicality of turning a root vegetable into a breakfast staple. The cake was filling and long-lasting, offering energy for long days of labor or activism. Because sweet potatoes were plentiful and inexpensive, this dish became a common sight on tables throughout the Civil Rights era. It was a symbol of making do, a reminder that families could create joy from what the land provided. Sweet potato coffee cakes carried resilience in every bite, bringing comfort to households even in the hardest years. Apple butter toast was the kind of breakfast that came with a story. Thick, spiced apple butter spread over warm toast turned ordinary mornings into something memorable. The butter's deep brown color came from hours of slow cooking. Apples simmered with sugar, cinnamon, and cloves until they transformed into a smooth, fragrant paste. Grandparents often made it in big batches, filling jars to last through winter. Each spoonful carried the patience of a day spent stirring at the stove. On cold mornings, that same spread met the crackle of toast, melting slightly into the crumb, releasing a scent that filled the whole kitchen. It was sweet but grounded, rich but not heavy, the taste of comfort that lasted long after the meal was done. Apple butter toast wasn't about extravagance. It was about preservation, tradition, and the art of making something beautiful from what you grew. Red-eye gravy and biscuits gave breakfast a bold, bitter soul. Born from ham drippings and black coffee, it was thin, smoky, and sharp enough to wake you faster than any alarm. Grandparents poured the hot coffee into the greasy skillet, scraping the bottom to gather every bit of flavor. The smell hit first, strong, dark, and unmistakable. Fresh biscuits soaked it up like sponges, turning bitter into savory beauty. It was a meal for workers, for those who rose before dawn and needed fire in their bellies. Red-eye gravy did not pretend to be sweet or gentle. It was honest, intense, and unforgettable. Grandparents said it was a grown folks' breakfast, the kind that taught you to face the day head-on. The flavor was bold, a mix of smoke and bitterness that tasted like life itself, hard, sharp, but satisfying. Every bite carried stories of mornings spent in fields or factories, hands rough but hearts steady. It was more than a meal. It was morning courage in liquid form. Country sausage patties with cane syrup were a sweet and savory breakfast that carried the flavor of Southern tradition. Grandparents often made sausage from scratch or bought it fresh, shaping it into patties with practiced hands. The patties sizzled in the skillet, filling the house with a smell that meant the day was off to a strong start. Once cooked, they were served alongside cane syrup, thick and dark, ready for dipping or drizzling. The combination of salty sausage and sweet syrup created a harmony that felt indulgent even when the ingredients were simple. It stuck to your ribs, kept you full, and tasted like a morning wrapped in warmth. Cane syrup was cheaper and easier to find than maple syrup, but it had a bold flavor all its own. Families passed down the preference across generations, pairing it with biscuits, sausage, and sometimes even eggs. Country sausage patties with cane syrup were more than breakfast. They were the memory of Sunday mornings, crowded tables, and laughter rising like steam from the skillet. Pickled pig feet with bread were a dish that reflected both thrift and flavor, often served cold in rural communities as a morning meal. Pig feet, simmered and preserved in vinegar brine with spices, became a protein source that lasted far longer than fresh meat. Eaten with slices of bread, it was salty, tangy, and surprisingly filling. Families turned to it because it was cheap and practical, ensuring no part of the animal ever went to waste. The flavor carried a boldness that lingered, and though not every child enjoyed it, many adults looked back on it with fondness as a food of survival. In households where resources were scarce, a plate of pickled pig feet with bread could be enough to start the day. It was more than just sustenance. It was a dish that represented resilience and the ability to create meals from overlooked cuts. Pickled pig feet with bread carried strength, memory, and the taste of endurance in difficult times. Creamed cornmeal mush was the quiet hero of hard times, a breakfast that managed to feel rich even when money was thin. Made from simple ingredients, cornmeal, milk, salt, and water, it was stirred patiently over low heat until it thickened into a creamy golden porridge. Families would serve it hot in bowls with a little butter melting on top or a drizzle of syrup for sweetness. It was warm, filling, and endlessly adaptable, proof that comfort did not require luxury. When leftovers were chilled, they turned firm enough to slice and fry the next morning, crisping into golden slabs with a texture somewhere between toast and pudding. That second-day version was the real prize, a thrifty twist that made breakfast feel new again. The sound of those slices sizzling in a skillet was as homey as a family prayer before eating. Cornmeal mush might not sound glamorous, but it was nourishment that came with pride, a recipe born from resourcefulness and patience. In kitchens that measured success not by wealth but by warmth, this humble dish held its place as a symbol of care and survival, the kind of meal that hugged you from the inside out. Cornbread and buttermilk was breakfast born of simplicity and strength. Grandparents crumbled leftover cornbread into bowls, poured cold buttermilk over the top, and stirred until soft and thick. It was tangy, creamy, and filling, the perfect meal when cupboards were bare. The sourness of the buttermilk balanced the sweetness of the bread, making each bite taste new again. It was food that cooled the body in summer, soothed it in winter, and satisfied hunger all year long. No stove, no fuss, just ingredients that were always on hand. It was eaten with a spoon, quiet and steady, often in the same bowls used for supper. There was nothing fancy about it, but it carried the wisdom of generations: never waste, never want. It was a poor person's breakfast, yes, but one made with pride. Some folks added a pinch of salt or a drizzle of syrup, but it never needed more than it had. The clinking of spoons and the sound of quiet chewing told stories of endurance and contentment. In a world that asked for more, this humble meal taught gratitude for what was already there. Butter sugar toast was the quick, sweet breakfast many children rushed toward before school, made from nothing more than bread, butter, and a sprinkle of sugar. Grandparents spread the butter all the way to the edges, making sure every bite would melt just right. The toast warmed the sugar until it softened slightly, creating a delicate crunch that felt almost like a treat. It was simple, fast, and inexpensive, yet it tasted like something far more indulgent. For many children, this was the breakfast they could hold in one hand while tying their shoes with the other. It tasted like busy mornings, like running out the door with crumbs on your shirt, like the gentle love of someone who wanted you fed. Even when there was no time, butter sugar toast may be overlooked today, but the memory of it still lingers for anyone who grew up on its warm sweetness. But stewed prunes and citrus offered a naturally sweet and nourishing side that fit perfectly with the back-to-nature movement of the 1970s. Dried prunes were simmered gently in water with slices of orange or lemon until they softened into a rich compote. A touch of cinnamon or clove added warmth, and the citrus brightened the deep, earthy flavor of the fruit. This dish required little sugar because the natural sweetness of the prunes intensified as they cooked, creating a syrupy juice that tasted indulgent yet wholesome. Served warm over oatmeal, alongside biscuits, or even chilled with yogurt, it provided fiber and essential vitamins that families valued. African American households embraced it for both its practicality and comfort, turning an inexpensive ingredient into something special. Stewed prunes and citrus stood as a testament to mindful cooking, where a simple pot of fruit could deliver nutrition and quiet pleasure, reminding everyone that breakfast could be as healthful as it was delicious without any extravagant ingredients or effort. Pork dripping toast was a breakfast born of thrift, where nothing from a meal ever went unused. After roasting pork, families saved the fat drippings, which cooled and solidified into a spreadable form. Spread over a slice of bread and warmed, it became a quick, filling meal that carried both flavor and energy. Children often ate it before school, while adults grabbed it before heading to long days of work. The taste was rich and salty, a reminder of the meat that provided it even when only fat remained. Pork dripping toast reflected both scarcity and ingenuity, turning something that might otherwise be discarded into sustenance. It was a dish remembered fondly for its practicality, though it spoke clearly of hard times. For many, the memory of pork dripping toast carries with it the smell of the kitchen, the sound of a skillet cooling, and the resourcefulness of families who could not afford to waste a single drop. It was humble, yet deeply tied to survival. Fried salt pork with eggs was breakfast before bacon took over the world. Thick slabs of cured pork belly hit a cast-iron skillet and began to sizzle, releasing a fragrance that woke the whole house. The fat crisped into edges that crackled with salt and flavor, while the drippings in the pan turned liquid gold. Into that same pan went the eggs, frying in the rendered fat until the whites blistered and the yolks gleamed. It was salty, rich, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that stayed with you through a day of hard labor. No one worried about cholesterol or calories back then. Food like this was about survival, satisfaction, and a little morning joy. Fried salt pork was poor man's bacon, but it never tasted like second best. Served with biscuits or grits, it brought warmth and strength to the table. It was a breakfast that said, "You'll make it through today." The smell lingered long after breakfast ended, clinging to aprons and walls like a memory of comfort. Sometimes a drizzle of blackstrap molasses or a spoon of apple butter cut through the salt, turning it into something almost sweet. Every bite carried the weight of hard work and the warmth of home, a reminder that strength could start from the simplest pan. Smoked herring and rice was the ocean's gift to the southern kitchen. The herring came salted and cured, strong enough to scent the air even before cooking. Grandparents soaked it first, softening its bite, then fried it in a pan until the edges curled and crisped. The fish went over hot rice, its smoky oil dripping down like seasoning. The meal was bold, salty, rich, and unforgettable. For those who lived near the coast, it was a taste of home and history, connecting generations through flavor. The smell might have been sharp, but it spoke of sustenance and pride. Smoked herring and rice was food that filled the stomach and lingered on the soul. It reminded everyone that humble ingredients could build mighty traditions. Every plate told the same story of struggle, resourcefulness, and the sea's generosity, carried into the kitchen with faith and fire. The salt of the fish met the warmth of the rice in perfect rhythm, a balance of sea and soil. Sometimes a splash of hot sauce or a side of cornbread completed the plate, making something humble feel whole. Even long after breakfast was done, the scent stayed, a memory of mornings when families found strength in what they had and gratitude in what they shared. Cracklin' biscuits were a breakfast born from tradition, from kitchens where pork cracklings were saved and treasured because they added flavor nothing else could match, mixed into biscuit dough. The cracklings melted slightly as the biscuits baked, releasing savory richness into every bite. Grandparents made these biscuits with steady hands and an understanding of how to stretch ingredients while still creating something deeply satisfying. The result was warm, crumbly, and full of flavor, a biscuit that needed no butter or jam to taste complete. It was the kind of breakfast that connected families to their heritage, to moments when nothing went to waste and everything had a purpose. Children often loved the surprising crunch, not realizing it came from a history of thrift and creativity. Cracklin' biscuits remain a powerful memory for many, a taste of home that has the strength of generations behind it. Collard green and onion hash gave leafy greens a starring role, turning a traditional dinner side into a savory breakfast companion. Fresh collard greens were sliced thin and quickly sautéed with sweet onions, a little garlic, and a splash of vegetable broth until tender yet vibrant. The result was a smoky, nutrient-rich hash that paired beautifully with eggs, grits, or cornbread. Some families added diced potatoes for extra heartiness, while others seasoned with a pinch of red pepper flakes to wake up the taste buds. This dish reflected a deep appreciation for garden vegetables and the ingenuity of African-American cooks who brought dinner flavors to the morning table. Collard green and onion hash provided iron, vitamins, and a satisfying warmth that lasted through long days. Its quick preparation and bold taste made it a weekday favorite, while its connection to Southern tradition made it feel timeless, proving that breakfast could be as wholesome and flavorful as any evening meal. Fried bologna on white bread was one of the most common breakfasts for working families during the Civil Rights era. Bologna was affordable, and frying it in a skillet brought out flavor and made it feel more substantial. Layered on soft white bread with mustard or hot sauce, it became a sandwich that was cheap, quick, and filling. For children, it was often packed as lunch, but for adults, it was breakfast before long shifts in fields, factories, or offices. The salty, savory taste was familiar and comforting, even if it came from one of the cheapest meats available. Fried bologna sandwiches symbolized both thrift and practicality, reflecting the reality of what many households relied on to get by. They were humble, but they carried enough strength to power people through demanding days. This dish became part of the memory of struggle and perseverance, a reminder that even inexpensive food could play a role in fueling determination and resilience. Fried potatoes and onions, or home fries as many called them, were the true breakfast of yesterday's leftovers. Cold potatoes from dinner were sliced thin and tossed in a skillet with sizzling butter or lard. Onions followed, their sweetness blooming as they browned. The two cooked together until the edges crisped and the smell filled the kitchen with comfort. Salt, pepper, maybe a pinch of paprika. That was all they needed. Each forkful was smoky and soft, full of the flavor that only time and care could give. It was food for early risers and late sleepers alike, eaten from chipped plates at wooden tables. Home fries were the definition of resourcefulness. Nothing wasted. Everything transformed. Served with eggs or just on their own, they carried the quiet satisfaction of a meal made from yesterday's effort. In the hum of the morning, that skillet was both memory and promise. Sorghum syrup biscuits were the sweet glue of country mornings, simple yet divine. Grandparents mixed flour, lard, and milk, cutting the dough by hand and baking it until the tops turned golden. While the biscuits rose, the sorghum syrup sat warming on the stove, thick, dark, and sticky as the sun coming up. Sorghum was cheaper than sugar and easier to find, made from local cane that families often grew themselves. When the biscuits came out, steaming and soft, a drizzle of syrup transformed them into luxury. The smell filled the room, earthy, rich, and pure. Kids licked their fingers, and adults smiled quietly, knowing this was a taste of home. The syrup clung to the edges of the biscuits, turning every bite into a memory. It was breakfast, dessert, and comfort all at once. Even on hard days, sorghum biscuits gave sweetness without waste. They were the pride of the Southern table, humble, homemade, and healing. Sautéed onions and eggs were a simple breakfast that leaned on pantry staples when meat was scarce or too costly. Grandparents sliced onions thin and cooked them slowly until they softened and browned, releasing their sweetness into the skillet. Then came the eggs, cracked right over the top and scrambled gently so the onions intertwined with every bite. The result was savory, aromatic, and surprisingly comforting. This was working-class fuel, a breakfast that tasted far richer than its ingredients implied children might not have asked for it. But once the onions and eggs were on the plate, the flavor spoke for itself. It was warm, filling, and quietly satisfying, the kind of meal that taught you how to appreciate the depth hidden in simple ingredients. Sautéed onions and eggs were proof that good cooking came from skill, not expense. Peach cobbler oatmeal captured the sweet essence of a beloved dessert while remaining wholesome enough for breakfast. Rolled oats simmered slowly in milk until creamy, then were topped with juicy peaches cooked down with a little brown sugar and a hint of cinnamon. The warm fruit formed a syrupy topping that soaked into the oats, creating a bowl that tasted indulgent but felt nourishing. Some families added a dollop of butter or a drizzle of honey for extra richness, while others sprinkled crushed pecans for a pleasant crunch. This dish mirrored the flavors of a classic peach cobbler while staying simple and hearty, making it a favorite in African-American households seeking both comfort and health. Peach cobbler oatmeal proved that morning meals could echo the desserts of family gatherings, carrying the warmth of summer peaches and the memory of sweet celebrations into every spoonful, turning an everyday breakfast into something gently festive and deeply satisfying without excess effort. Which breakfast would you beg your grandmother to make one more time? Drop it in the comments and share your favorite morning memory. Hit like if these breakfasts brought back something powerful, and subscribe so we keep honoring the meals our elders knew by heart.